I'm still scared to try again. 'Cause you're still friends with all my friends. Our mistakes are haunting me, and it turns out that I still can't breathe.
So let me ask you this next question. I kind of have these different, basically I didn't have any like preset questions lined up. I basically go by categories. It's basically like your life, your music, your faith. It's just kind of these different categories. But it's for me, it's just, I love bringing up the questions that really get people grooving. Like it's the kind of questions that like, this is my jam. Like we'll talk about this for 1,000 years kind of thing. And so really it's just finding that rhythm and finding that thing that you can talk about. And so, but one question I have is actually asking you to answer a question, which is this, who is Jesus? Like, who is Jesus to you?
Oh God. Jesus is, oh God, this is a very difficult, very, very difficult question to answer for me personally. Because if I'm being candid, I don't actually know.
Yeah.
I don't know fully at the moment. I know parts of who he is to me, but if I'm being honest, like I'm still wrestling with the person of Jesus. And I would much rather cautiously say, I don't know, than give an answer.
Well, that's good though. Like, it's better to have an authentic answer than to have a fake one. you know?
I think so.
Oh, that's good, man. Well, you can at least rest and stay on what you do know. We know he was a person. That's
true.
That's historically. That's one of the things that one of my friends, he is an atheist and he's a science guy, big science guy. And one of the things, it was so funny for me early on because we had just started to get to know each other, and we were talking about Jesus or whatever, and he's a lot more blunt than I am, but he said one of the stupidest things I always have to correct people on is when people say that Jesus is a fairy tale. Because I'm like, no, like I'm an atheist. I could tell you that's what he would tell me. He said, I'm an atheist. I could tell you he was a person. He's a historical person.
Yeah,
that was
a real
fact.
human being.
Like he was a real person. Stop talking about him like he's Bigfoot. Like, he's, and so we know that he was a person and it's weird because, I've found difficulty even answering that question. Like, who is Jesus to me? But the thing I always rest on is he was a person, and he was a person who had beliefs, who had ideas, and those ideas shaped the world. Whether you agree with them or not, they influenced the entire world. He was a person who had a dream. He was a person who believed with firm conviction what he held on to. But I'm glad that you're able to be honest and transparent and say like you don't know. But and that's always good. I think that's amazing.
I think so too.
In what ways do you feel like Jesus has? Well, I'll rephrase it. In what ways do you feel like Jesus has pursued you in your life?
That one's much easier to answer. No matter what
irony, because I always thought it would be the opposite.
No matter what I tried to do, no matter what I have ever tried to do, I have always been drawn back to the truth of Jesus Christ.
That's cool.
And at a certain point, in my mid-20s, in Bible college, I thought, screw it, I'm going to stop running. And I think that is, it's just this consistency. And I think it actually gave me like a lot of comfort too, to know that, because now when I go out and do things, I have this faith where it's kind of like, okay, some people tell me that what I believe or what I am doing or what I think or how I am as a person is wrong or sinful or problematic. It might be, but I believe wholeheartedly that no matter what I do, I will always be pulled back to him.
And
that's
there's a
amazing.
comfort. I love that.
There's a comfort in knowing that, because now I can go and explore ideas that the church maybe historically wouldn't explore. And the worst thing that's going to happen is I'm going to fall flat on my face and have to go through some very uncomfortable, humbling experiences, but I get to come back to the loving arms. So it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Man, I'm always kind of pressed here. There's like so many questions afterwards, but let's we'll dig into that a little bit as well. You say like the worst thing that can happen is that you'll just fall flat on your face and be welcomed back into the loving arms. So, so what do you do then with, like a passage, for example, where it talks about in Romans, like, should we go sinning more and more so that grace can abound? Romans 5, and it says, surely not, for do you not realize that when you're baptized into Jesus's life, you're baptized into his death,
Sure.
so that you could be raised and walk. And so the whole point is, don't just flippantly just go and explore all these things because, you were crucified into his death as well as you're buried with him. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thoughts on that are Paul is correct. You shouldn't just flippantly and wantonly go out and do things. And when I say that I have the ability to go out and explore things that maybe members of the church wouldn't normally explore, I don't do anything flippantly or wantonly.
Yeah.
I specifically look at areas that I think maybe the church historically has gotten either A, the church has gotten wrong, or B, the church has twisted over time, and I'm willing to go out on a limb and explore it.
Yeah.
'Cause that's
Or
the thing.
or there's also C of they may have gotten it right, but how they apply it methodology is wrong.
Might be wrong. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the key, though, is understanding A, nothing is done flippantly, and B, we have to understand when Paul is talking about that, a lot of people too, it'll be like, well, why is this a sin? Well, don't go out and sin. Okay, but why is this a sin? Why is this a sin? It's the same thing with my viewpoints on sexuality. It's like, well, I can't comprehend as to why sex outside of marriage is sinful. I can't. I physically just cannot come to the conclusion as to why it's sinful. I know the systematic theological argument about how, Adam and Eve in the garden and leaving your mother and your father and being entwined to one person, and Jesus talking about marriage and don't divorce your wife and all these things, like all and the Levitical code in reference to. But that's the thing, all of it is predicated on systematic theology, and that systematic theology is then predicated on a cultural understanding of marriage. So for me, I think to myself, okay, well, is there something deeper? Should I investigate this? Because is this something that maybe traditionally we've gotten a little bit backwards?
Yeah.
And hopefully I find an answer, and then whatever the answer is, I can apply it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even diving into that topic a little bit more is like, because for me, everything that I believe is based on the person that I've come to understand as God and Jesus. When I read the Bible, part of what I write in my book is that it's all about trying to teach something very old, but in a new way. And it's bringing people back to understanding what Jesus intended for his followers to be. And so I teach it from the perspective of, I start people with a question, which is, what does it mean to simply love Jesus? Spoiler alert. And I talk about, asking that question over and over and over and over. And you ask it so many times. The reason being is because the more that you ask that question, the more you should have a desire to know who God is as a person. And then when you have a desire to know who God is as a person, that's what motivates you to get into the scriptures, because, and that's another question we can get into is, what is your view on the Bible? What is your view on the scriptures? Because that could also drastically change your perspective of how you approach anything in life. And so, but for me, the scriptures is God's inspired word through he spoke. It's weird because this is a hot take that I would take one day, but I haven't fully fleshed out the thought, but the raw thought is that, we often say that God speaks to you through his word. And I'm like, yes, but we often forget the middleman, which is like God is speaking to you through other people he spoke to. So I believe that God, the scriptures are God's inspired word to us as a means to know who God is as a person, what he cares about, what is precious to him, and we see that laid out through a narrative. And so when it comes to things like sexuality, like I look at people can bring up all these different passages. For me, whether it's same-sex attraction or whatever, for me, I always go back to that very first page in Genesis, and I talk about how, and you've probably heard this before, but it's the idea that the two become, I look at it as more of a thematic progression.
Sure.
I don't look at it as explicitly, because I look at, what do you have the very beginning? What do you have? You have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and you have this pair.
Sure.
And then everything else, you have all these pairs: the sun and the moon, the creatures of the waters above and the waters below. You have the creatures of the land and the creatures of the sea. You have the oceans and the rivers. It's all these pairs that keep being created. And then what is the very last pair? The very last pair was man and woman.
Yes.
And then what happens to that pair? The pinnacle of all creation, this leading up to all that encompasses the two become one. And then Garden of Eden represents this shared space that, as weird as it almost represents the sexuality of man and woman. And it's a really bad way to word it, but in the sense of, like, it was symbolized of the two becoming one, which is how heaven and earth become one. God and the church are becoming one, is the perfect picture of the two becoming one.
Sure.
And what that looks like played out through man and woman is, for them, is their being man and wife and being, having sex, which, granted, heaven and earth don't have sex, but it's symbolized as the two becoming one, in that oneness. And in that moment, the earliest Hebrew scholars always look at that moment as God establishing sexuality as sacred. And these things are things that he finds sacred, and these are the things he finds important.
Sorry, when you say early Hebrew scholars, what are you talking about in specific?
So I would be butchering
Sure.
names if I try to pronounce them, but for me, it's looking at the documents that come from, I don't have a copy with me. I had them online. I have to fish them out of a paper, but it's the documents that come from I'm going to butcher the name, not the Mishnah. It's the flip. What's it called? It's the thing where literally it's the commentaries of the first century.
The Talmud?
Yes, that's the one. And different people in there who have, age old past. That was why people in Jesus's day, they held these views, is because these are the things that, people from forever ago. That's the one thing that they've always believed in. There wasn't a point in Israel's history where they didn't believe in that, except for unless it would be more recent, if anything. But especially around the time of Jesus's day and their culture, I think different people who have written on this is, I just moved, so all my books are in a box, but it's Seeing the World. Oh gosh, what's it called? Seeing the World Through. Hold on. Oh gosh. Greco-Roman culture, Greco-Roman world, the Greco-Roman world. Yes, the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament by James Jeffers. So you have like people like him, books like that, which talk about the older culture and what were their views and all the sources that he cites and stuff like that. I don't know if N.T. Wright's The New Testament in Its World references this, but I would imagine it would, given the people he often quotes from. You have all these people who reference that one passage, at least people who are like Hebrew scholars. I know Tim Mackey, I believe, also would reference this passage.
Tim Mackey's great.
He is great. I love that guy. And I wish I could meet him one day. But Bible Project, not a sponsor, but it should be. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so you have all these people who are these Hebrew scholars, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'll trust people who are smarter than me, who look at that passage and see that what they're intending to do is lay this out as God establishing this as sacred, which is why their culture establishes that as sacred. And so, at least for me personally, I look at that and I'm like, okay, well, if that matters to God, then that definitely needs to matter to me, because I care about God, because I love God. I want to care about what he cares about.
Yes.
And one of the things I write about in my book was, I know I keep referencing my book, but it's not even out yet, so I don't know why I keep referencing it. But anyways, I just remember things I threw in there. And so one of the things I talk about is how I believe, as a modern illustration, sin is the equivalent of cheating on a relationship with God. And that for me changed my perspective completely on how I saw sin, because it was no longer this establishment idea of sin or whatever, it was now very personal. That's really what it represents. If all of sin is about this me focused mentality, doing what I think is right, what is best for me, and doing whatever, and you read Psalms, and how it's in the Psalms, it says that sin grieves the heart of God, and you see all these things on God's response to sin, and people focus so much on the wrath of God, but I think that's really a result and an outpouring of his sadness, his desire for things not to be that way. And I think, and as someone who's been cheated on before, and I think, man, if sin is the equivalent of cheating on a relationship with God, if what I have is a relationship with God, then that is what sin would be. Then, man, I don't ever want to cast that kind of hurt towards God, and to know that everything I'm doing is casting that, and that includes the things that he cares about, which would be, sexuality. He cares about ethnicity, all these things he finds sacred. Life is sacred, and the list goes on. But
I suppose my few pushbacks on that are, of course, the very obvious ones, like the rampant polygamy in the Old Testament. Right, David and his many wives, Solomon and his many wives.
Well, I mean, the
Abraham and his
pushback to
many
that
wives.
is the pushback to that, and this goes on another hot take that I had. I don't think people, when they read the Bible, they should start with the book of Matthew. Like, that's what we encourage most people to do. Like, when you read the Bible, don't start with the beginning. and that's, I put my pushback on that is, no, start with the beginning, because the problem is, if you start with the Bible and you start with Matthew, you have this subconscious idea that everything you read in the Bible is good. Because from Matthew forward, it's all good.
Sure,
like, there's not really,
I see.
There's nothing really bad that happens. But like,
sort
in
of,
the
though,
beginning,
like for example, though, with like Paul's letters, when he's talking about things like, you shouldn't have more than one wife, right? He's specifically only talking to deacons in the church, as polygamy was still a very viable part of the first century Judaism.
Well, that doesn't. It's just because he doesn't. It doesn't just because he says, like, for example, okay, so going back to David.
Sure.
Ever since Genesis and after that first page, the whole point of that afterwards was that everything they're doing is royally screwing up. And so just because something happens does not mean that's God's design. Doesn't mean that was God's intention. Sure. And you're totally right about the whole, Paul referencing these people, that he's like, hey, be the only person of one wife. That is for deacons. That doesn't also mean that it wasn't good or intended to be that way.
I suppose.
I think. For the same reason that slave, we could use that same argument for slaves and their masters,
sure.
Because
like Paul was talking about a specific context in time, and there was different cultural norms at the time, which I completely and totally understand. The main overlying issue, though, that I have is that the entirety of the whole marriage argument is predicated, like, at least its most solid foundation is predicated on the story of Genesis, right? The Adam and Eve narrative.
Yeah.
And the perfection of the garden. The issue with that, though, being, at least as far as I see it, is the garden. This is, I might get in a little bit of trouble. Garden narrative is not literal. And beyond that, that in reference to the oneness. Okay, so this is a very difficult topic to have, because to discuss for a few reasons. One, this is not exactly my area of expertise. I've done a lot of reading on it, but it's not my area.
Yeah.
So I'll
it's a great place to have ideas. And we always have the disclaimer that my disclaimer always is, hey, I don't know everything, but these are my ideas right now. I don't know if they're right, but hey, that's part of growing.
The thing that really makes it difficult for me is the fact that if you understand enough about Hebrew poetry and Hebrew literature, actually no, I'll rephrase it. If you know enough about Hebrew poetry and then origin story literature of, like, basically any group of people at that time frame, the way that Genesis 1 and 2 and then 2 to 12 is written is, it's not written to be understood as history. It's written to be understood as origin story. So it's difficult to build a theology that is literal, in the sense of, like, we are literally interpreting that the one, like, the perfection of human sexuality is between a man and a woman in the confines of marriage. When that origin story was built and was written, they had no concept of marriage. Marriage was not a thing until the Mosaic era. And that story, either A, depending on how you view it, came out of the Mosaic era or came before the Mosaic era. And even after the Mosaic, the Moses era, polygamous marriage was still rampant until the time of Jesus. So we have to always understand the contexts in which these stories were written. And I have a hard time building a theology off of a story that was built in a time where not only was polygamy allowed, but origin stories weren't supposed to be understood as history. Like, this is one man and one woman in the Garden of Eden, but it's supposed to be understood as like, is not history from their perspective of what history is, not history as in how we view history, but history how they view history, which is like, natives are similar, right? The great eagle in the sky and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, so and so going even a little bit more into what you're saying, like even if it is intended as poetry, I don't think and this is another just more side opinion. Like I don't think just because I believe it is poetry, but I also think it is telling history. Like just because it's poetry doesn't mean it's not real. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just I could tell poetry based on my. I was gonna say I could tell poetry based on my life. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Sure.
Now, also just because it's poetry doesn't mean that it's not the picture of how things should be. Like it's and this
totally
is why
fair.
Yeah, this is why in Revelation, for example, this is why what makes the Bible so good is that the bookend of Revelation reflects the very beginning of Scripture. Like it's all about the short version of the Bible is that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and they were one and together, and everything was right, and sin split them apart, and the whole point of it is bringing them back together.
Yes,
and that's what we see at the very end. And
I agree with that completely. I think my major issue is that even though it is poetry, and even though it is telling a truism, as in like what is the ideal and perfect understanding of things, it's difficult to assume that what the original authors of that poetry or of that story were attempting to communicate was that marriage is specifically between one man and one woman, considering the cultural context in which it was written. Yeah, that's the thing that makes it difficult for me. And then beyond that, in regards to contemporary issues, we see this often. We see this massive issue between what evangelical Christians believe to be true, which is, the perfect marriage is between a man and a woman, that, they should only be the only ones who are allowed to rear children, et cetera, all of these issues. And then we have the world, which does their own thing, and the church would say, well, that's wrong, and they shouldn't do that. But the problem is, and here's the big kicker, is a lot of very healthy, happy, well put together people are in relationships that the church would not ordain as correct. And they are living in a way that is holistically good. Like they have children, like let's say like a lesbian couple, they have children and good jobs, and they contribute to their society, and they treat each other with respect. And to an extent, they show a more honest biblical understanding of what a marriage would look like. Right? Like one submitting to the other, and the other, loving the other, and then the whole back and forth, right? Paul's whole diatribe about, a husband should love his wife and the wife should submit to the husband, kind of thing. But they actually live that out like very, very, very well, where there is also families in the church who don't do that at all. And it's this weird disconnect. And I think the thing is we, as the church, maybe we are correct. Maybe the church is correct on the issue of gender and sexuality in regards to, but once again, it's the implementation aspect, and it's asking the question, well, dang, man, like if they're getting it wrong, why are they doing it better than we are? And that's not all of them, obviously. There's a lot of issues in the homosexual community as well, which, there's no point in me talking about it at the moment. But they have their own. They're not perfect, obviously. But there's these questions of, well, if there are people who can do marriage and life and relationship without Christ perfectly fine, and without doing it within the biblical model of what is correct, then the question is asked, well, what evidence do we have that is actually an incorrect way of doing relationship outside of our one specific view on theology?
Yeah. And those are great points. It's one of the falsehoods that I try to correct in people that I talk to is the idea that like, oh, well, if you don't believe in God, you're just going to have an awful life and you're not going to be able to experience any of these things. I'm like, that's not true at all. Like, I know,
it's
I know
really
some atheists who are better Christians than some pastors. Like,
Yeah.
the difference is it perfect? Like, for example, this is what I mean by that. I always say the people are attracted to what they're missing out on.
Sure.
And the question is, are you living your life in a way that teaches others they're missing out on something if they don't have Jesus? Like, I think at the end of the day, whatever you believe, you want to believe in God, you want to believe in whatever, you want to be Buddhist, whatever. If you want to convince me of anything, any stance you could possibly have, this is literally what changed my perspective on social justice. What changed my perspective when I grew up in a very, for lack of better words, a very like privileged life, and had this very perspective of a very what you would expect someone who was raised in the South to believe. And so, but what changed my perspective was when I was living in Chicago, was I was surrounded by people who lived their life in a way that showed me I was missing out on something if I did not understand this or whatever. And so for me, when it came to social justice, for me, it was because I spent the 2 years that I was there, every single week, I would go and preach to over almost 1,000 homeless men every week at this halfway house. And I would go and preach there every single week. And one day, one of the guys invited me to come to his parents' place where they're having this big block party. And they had this big barbecue and stuff like that. And that whole day shifted my perspective on my biases and my prejudice and whatever. Because I experienced life and I saw I was missing out on something that I wasn't experiencing within this community, and that shifted my perspective. So whatever it is that you believe out there, it's like, if you believe this or that, you believe this God or that God or whatever, like the only way you will convince me, and I think the only way that is healthiest to convince other people, is that you live it in a way that you show them they're missing out on something. And I think, that's why I firmly believe at the end of the day, that's why I'll never run away from Jesus, because at the end of the day, like, you can't get better than Jesus. At the end of the day, like, as hard as it is, as difficult as life is, as much as I wish I could not follow God right now, I can't, because I will ultimately be missing out on something without Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the perfection. It is the everything else without God is just not good enough. It's good, but there's always something missing. And without Jesus, there's nothing missing.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with that for the most part. I guess the question is what does missing out on Jesus look like in a person's life? Like, how could it be better?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess rephrase that, because I heard that as two different. I was going to go one way, but I heard that as two different questions.
Sure.
I guess, can you rephrase it?
Yeah, so you talked about how, like, people's lives can be just fine and dandy without Jesus. They can live good lives. But what would Jesus actually add to their life?
Yeah. I would say, for one, I mean, definitely a bunch of things, but I would say for the first one that comes to mind, the Bible talks a lot about, as I'm paraphrasing this passage, but essentially it's talking about how you can't understand the truths of God without having God in your life, because it's almost as if there's this veil over your eyes without the Spirit illuminating that to you. And so I think having Jesus in your life pulls back the veil, as it were, and the way that you see reality and the realities of this world. And I think what that means, and I think this is one of the things that what Jesus does, is it makes you realize what the results are of our self-serving nature. Like, I believe everyone is inherently selfish at the end of the day. I think that, which is another, I equate sin and selfishness. I interchange those terms a lot. And I think the ultimate problem in life right now is that we're all inherently selfish. At the end of the day, we have a nature that is ultimately self-seeking. It's what I want. It's what I need. It's what's best for me. And I think what Jesus does is it pulls someone outside of, it completely changes their nature to realize that the goal in life is to push away from this me self-focused nature and to focus less on myself and to focus more on being a person of generosity and serving other people. And I think without Jesus, you can try to aim for that. You can be a generous person, but I think at the end of the day, it will not be part of who you are until you accept Jesus, because without him you'll be running after it with your energy, and that will eventually run dry. Like it will eventually, and it won't be nature to you. It will not be, I don't know what the word is, but it just won't be nature to you. It will be second or third nature. And to actually make it who you are, to live and to realize the reward of serving others and and being a person of generosity and caring for others, and self-sacrifice, crucifying yourself, denying yourself, that's the word, denying yourself, and realize you're denying that selfish nature, and the reward of as hard as it may be, as difficult as it may be, living to serve others is so rewarding. And I think that's what in my opinion, the most primary thing that Jesus provides. And you can't have that without him, because without him, you're still, as selfless as you may try to be, as generous as you may try to be, there's within you still an inherently me-focused nature. And it's only God who removes that,
I'm not over you. Let's be honest. I wanna let it bleed. Let's be honest. I'm not over you. I'm still scared to try again, 'cause you're still friends with all my friends. Our mistakes are haunting me, and it turns out that I still can't breathe.